Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start us off. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar of the Islands Trust Conservancy Speaker Series. The webinar today is Species at Risk and Critical Habitat Protection on Non-Federal Lands. My name is Wendy Tyrrell, and I'm going to be your host today. And I'm very grateful to our presenters and each of you for taking the time to join us today in learning more about species at risk in our region. And I'd like to start this meeting off with an acknowledgement. And I want you to please feel inspired, if you do, to write an acknowledgement in the chat. And so with that, with respect, I would like to acknowledge that we're all gathered here from our homes and workplaces across the lands and waters of the Coast Salish peoples. In acknowledging the first people of this place and their longstanding relationships with respect, stewardship, reciprocity, with plants, animals, land, and water, I'm humbled and inspired by my work, and also reminded of the special part that we play in restoring cultural, spiritual connections to the land of all people, along with ourselves, as we work towards protecting and restoring the land itself. And this is key to moving forward in a good way. So today's presentation is one of a series of webinars that the Islands Trust Conservancy is hosting. Over the past 31 years, the together with local conservancies and landholders, community members, we've helped to protect special places by encouraging, undertaking, and assisting in voluntary conservation initiatives within what we call the Islands Trust area. We currently have 34 nature reserves and we hold 79 conservation covenants. And that's a total of 1,375 hectares of land protected throughout the islands in the Salish Sea, along with the other protected lands that other land conservation organizations and these hold. With partners and the amazing team of 7 we strive to ensure that the special places remain healthy and functioning ecosystems. That's the goal. So in addition to supporting voluntary conservation action and managing these protected places, we also have a species at risk program now. The Islands Trust Conservancy's Species at Risk program was launched in 2020 and made possible by funding awarded to us by Environment and Climate Change Canada through their Priority Places funding stream. The SAR program is focused on facilitating research, collaboration, and the recovery of endangered species and ecosystems on these islands. We are all striving to do this by establishing partnerships for more effective actions, developing educational materials and events like these, supporting voluntary conservation actions, as I talked about, to restore and protect species and ecosystems at risk. If you hear me say SEER or SAR, SEER would stand for Species and Ecosystems at Risk, and SAR stands for Species at Risk, in case you're not familiar with those acronyms. We also are working to build relationships, respectful, inclusive program, and developing relationships with and collaboration opportunities with First Nations. Conducting biological surveys, monitoring, and mapping for species at risk is a large part of what the funding is focused towards. And you'll hear about work we've been working with, projects we've been working with Carrina, Laura on with sharp-tailed snake and other species. So I came on board as the program coordinator in 2021, and I have thankfully worked in land conservation for almost 20 years. I've worked with regional land trusts and have done a lot of coordinating of community-based restoration projects. I really am enjoying working with our team and building on this SAR program, working with partners and community members and everyone we work with. It's really been really enjoyable and a huge learning experience. So with that, I want to get us started on the agenda of the day. So quickly, I'm going to go over some housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, we're going to hold those off until the end. After housekeeping notes and introducing the presenters, I'll hand it over to Dr. Carrina Maslovat. And after that, we'll host a Q&A panel style session with Carrina, Laura, Matthias, and Undiné, Thompson. And at the end of the Q&A, we'll do closing remarks, and then there'll be a short post-webinar survey once you end your session. So we should have you free and clear out of here by 2:30. Okay. Now I just want to take a moment to introduce Gemma Green. Gemma, say hi. Gemma is our covenant manager and outreach specialist. Many of you know Gemma, and she is going to be today our go-to person for any technical issues you might encounter. So I can't find my mute button, why can't I see the presenters, etc., those kinds of things. She's also going to monitor the waiting room and the chat for questions. So I'm very thankful for Gemma. Thank you for helping me out today. You can, if you click on the chat box, you should be able to do a drop down and find Gemma there if you want to send her a private message outside of the main chat room. Okay, housekeeping reminders. First of all, the webinar is being recorded, so I want to let you know that. We're asking that people stay muted for the duration of the presentation, and there is a mute button down below that you should be able to click on if you're unmuted. We also ask that please be present during the presentation. We encourage you to turn on your camera. Some of you may need to turn it off. Some of you may not want to be recorded. We completely understand that. But if you could turn on your camera, we would love that. And then again, use a chat box to ask questions. Okay, so we have 3 presenters with us today, all of whom are really experienced and knowledgeable about species at risk on the islands of the Salish Seas, and we're very grateful to work with these specialists. Our primary speaker today is Carrina Maslovat. Carrina is the owner and manager of Maslovat Consulting, and she's a botanist and ecologist by training. Carrina has worked as a species at risk consultant for over 25 years. She's worked with sharp-tailed snakes since 2018, doing surveys, developing environmental DNA protocols, sampling protocols. And Carrina is passionate about ecology, ecological restoration. She has co-authored many scientific papers and has designed and restored wetlands, forests, coastal sand dunes, and Garryoak ecosystems to create habitat for species at risk. Our second presenter, we have Laura Matthias. Laura is a biologist with over 25 years of experience in the field of wildlife biology, specializing in a wide range of species at risk work, designing, implementing habitat restoration projects in, again, wetland, forest, coastal sands, and Garryoak ecosystems. Her focus are species include birds, plants, reptiles, amphibians, bats, and gastropods. It's a nice suite of species there. Laura has co-authored numerous scientific papers, and her current research involves developing protocols for novel environmental DNA to detect rare terrestrial species. We also have with us Undiné Thompson. Undiné is the Senior Consultation Biologist for the Pacific region of the Canadian Wildlife Service, which is a branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Undiné leads consultation and engagement on species at risk documents, and she's working on the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives and knowledge in those efforts. Her undergrad focus was in environmental geography and biology, and her master's focused on Garryoak ecosystems conservation for regional adaptation to climate change. So Undiné is going to be joining us at 2 o'clock for the Q&A session of the webinar to answer any questions related to SAR, recovery planning documents, legislation, those kinds of questions. So with that, I am going to hand over the talking stick to Carrina, and she'll begin her presentation.
Thank you, Wendy. I just want to say a big thank you to Wendy and Gemma and all the folks at the Islands Trust Conservancy for inviting us to be part of this seminar series. Laura and I have been working on sharp-tailed snakes for the last 5 years or so, and earlier in the year we did similar presentation to talk to the land managers that we work quite closely with and whose lands that we monitor sharp-tailed snakes on, including Islands Trust Conservancy. And Wendy asked if we would present something similar to this group here to expand the range to a broader group of people. Excuse me. So we're really looking forward to chatting with you and sharing with you, and there should be lots of time left at the end of the presentation to answer questions. So we'll just get rolling. Next slide, please, Wendy.
Did that not?
Not yet. Not for me anyway.
Okay, let's try that again.
I'm still showing the main slide on my end.
Okay, hold on one second.
Yeah.
A little funny thing going on here. I have lost my window.
Oh dear.
Yeah, hold on. I'll figure this out.
So for those of you that aren't familiar with sharp-tailed snakes, that was a really nice close-up of one. You can see the coloring on them. You can see they're quite smooth. They don't have keels on their scales, so they're quite soft and smooth when you touch them. And they've also got that really characteristic sort of thorn shape on the tail. So that's sort of who we'll be talking about today in the context of these bigger questions. Next slide, please, Wendy. So we're going to look at a couple of key questions today. The first one is, what does it mean to have critical habitat on lands that are managed by nonprofit or non-federal lands? So critical habitat is land that is designated under the Species at Risk Act. And we'll go into that a little bit more just to explain what that means and how that's designated. And then the other piece of this presentation is going to talk about stewardship actions and what landowners and land managers can do to protect rare species, including sharp-tailed snake on lands that they manage. Next slide, please. So probably, as most people that are at the presentation today know, Garry oak ecosystems and open Douglas fir forests are really rare in the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone. This is the habitat where sharp-tailed snakes are found, and there's less than 5% that's remaining in any sort of a natural state. And even those 5% that are remaining have been extremely degraded through invasive species primarily, but also through disruption of ecosystem processes such as fire suppression. Their habitat for well over 100 species at risk, including many that are federally listed under COSEWIC, the Committee of the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, and are also listed on the Species at Risk Act federally. And the remaining 5% of these places, quite a few of them are in protected areas like parks and nature reserves, and they're facing extreme pressure from recreation and also from just being loved to death. And this has all been exacerbated by the recent pandemic when people are wanting to get out and enjoy these areas. And so these tiny little postage stamp fragments that are left are really having a lot of extreme pressure on them. Next slide, please. So, oh, one back. You went two. Thank you. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about the sharp-tailed snake, Contia tenuis, which has been the focus of Laura and my work for the last little while. And we'll be using this sort of as an example of a species at risk and how this can sort of be a way of kind of getting a handle on some of these bigger questions. Many of the known sharp-tailed snake sites have been designated as critical habitat, and all of them require some form of stewardship. Sharp-tailed snakes are really small. They're about the size of a pencil, the adults, when they're all stretched out, but they're not stretched out very often. Usually when you find them, they're all curled up in a little tiny ball, and they're about the size of a quarter when they're all curled up. So they're not very big. And they spend most of their time underneath the ground. So they're incredibly difficult to find, and they're often in loose wood or talus slopes. And it seems from work that's been done up on Observatory Hill, it seems like they're more active at nighttime, which also complicates the way of actually finding them. They're unlike some of our other snakes in the area, the garter snakes that lay live young. Sharp-tailed snakes will lay eggs, which is really interesting. And so we think that they require those really warm south and west facing slopes for the eggs to be able to incubate and mature. And being cold-blooded reptiles, they also like those warm south facing aspects to be able to warm up and thermoregulate. They are non-venomous, they don't bite, they're just, as I said, they're really smooth and slippery, and they're really well camouflaged with the Douglas fir rotting woody debris. So they're tricky to find, but it's such a rare treat to actually get to see this species. Next slide, please. So when we're out doing surveys, we also take notes of all the other rare species that we come across in these Garryoke ecosystems so that we can communicate with the land managers and that they can be aware of these species to guide some of their management work. Some of these species are federally listed under the Species at Risk Act, and some of them are provincially listed by the Conservation Data Center as either red or blue listed, with the red listed being more at risk than the blue listed. And these photos are some of the rare species that we come across. On the top, in the middle there is common nighthawk. On the far right top is rigid apple moss. And then across the middle is western bumblebee, common wood nymph, olive-sided flycatcher, coastal schoolers catchfly, northern red-legged frog, fritillary, peregrine falcon, and yellow montane violet. So these are all species that we come across on Mount Tuam, where we've spent a lot of time working. It's a real hotspot for rare species. I think we're up to 38 provincially or federally listed species, which is the result of about, oh gosh, I think it's about 15 years that we've been doing intensive surveys up there, bringing in all kinds of different experts from different specialty areas. And so it's amassed this real incredible breadth of understanding of the species at risk. But every year that we're up there, we still continue to find new species. So it's a real testament to how much work is involved to get a really good picture of what is on the land and the rarity of which species are there. So by protecting critical habitat for sharp-tailed snakes, we can also protect the habitat for this really broad range of other species. So sharp-tailed snake works really well as an umbrella species, because if you can protect the habitat for sharp-tailed snake, you can also protect a lot of the habitat for these other species. And so it's kind of a way of a bit of a shorthand for finding a way of protecting habitat. Next slide, please. So where are sharp-tailed snakes found? They are found on southeastern Vancouver Island through Washington, Oregon, and then the center of their range is down in California. Next slide, please, Wendy. And in Canada, they're mostly focused on southeastern Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands. There was a population that was discovered up in Pemberton, which is that dot on the upper right of the map on the left. Thank you, Wendy. And when the status report was updated last year, the Pemberton sites were split into a different designatable unit, and that population is listed as endangered, and the ones on the southeastern Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands are now listed as threatened. This map is not complete. There was a sighting since this map was produced up in Ladysmith. There's another one over in Soup Potholes that was from iNaturalist, and Shane Johnson, who's on the call here, also found another site in Souk. So we're constantly finding new locations, which is great, but it has quite a limited distribution, and within these areas, of course, quite limited to those southeastern facing slopes, south facing slopes with the right kind of aspect. Next slide, please. So what protection measures are in place to try to protect the species? The big one is the Species at Risk Act, which was created on the premise that provincial governments would take the lead on species at risk protection on non-federal lands. So the Species at Risk Act was enacted in 2003, and it uses critical habitat to protect habitat. Critical habitat is the habitat that's required for species maintenance and recovery so that it doesn't become more at risk. One of the big challenges that we face in BC right now is that there's no overarching provincial legislation to be able to protect these species. So currently, the Species at Risk Act has the most teeth on federal lands, with the idea of effective protection being used on other lands, which is a variety of different stewardship options. But it's challenging on non-federal lands to have a big stick because we have this big hole with not having provincial legislation. And unfortunately, because we have this development pressure on private lands and a lack of provincial protection, there's often development right up to the edges of our protected areas. And as there's this increasing recreation pressure, it becomes really critical for non-governmental organizations to manage their lands effectively in order to maintain these refugia for species at risk. Next slide, please. So critical habitat protection on non-federal lands is focused on stewardship. Most sites in BC with species at risk are on non-federal lands and are protected by the safety net clause of the Species at Risk Act. I think a big number of our rare species are also found on private land. I've seen numbers that 38% of rare plants are on private lands, which is kind of shocking when you consider that only 5% of the land base in BC is private lands. We were in a meeting earlier this week, and Lynn Thompson said that she did a geospatial analysis and found that 80% of all red and blue listed species by the Conservation Data Center are on private lands. So it's a really disproportionate number of rare species that are not found on provincial or federal lands. So it puts a lot of pressure on NGOs and other land managers to be able to protect what species at risk there are. Next slide, please. So here's an example of critical habitat that's been mapped on Vancouver Island for sharp-tailed snakes. It includes Mount Macdonald, Mill Hill, Mount Work, which are CRD parks. And this is the way that critical habitat is mapped. It's the yellow outlined in black are the polygons, and then they're mapped within these red square bounding boxes. And the protection for critical habitat relies on the biophysical attributes, which is quite a detailed description of the specific habitat within these polygons that is protected. So we really need to protect the critical habitat, but there's also the challenge right now is that critical habitat is only mapped where species have actually been identified. And so there's a lot of areas where, because the survey effort hasn't been done, we don't know that there are sharp-tailed snakes, for example. And so it can't be mapped as critical habitat, even though the habitat is appropriate for the species. So it's a bit of a catch-22 that you can't protect them if you don't know they're there, and you can't know that they're there unless you do intensive survey efforts. So it makes it really challenging to try to conserve lands where the species has the habitat, but it hasn't actually been documented yet. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about some different stewardship actions. Stewardship is really critical on these non-federal lands because they're these remnants of what is left, and because they have this disproportionate number of rare species. There's a lot of work that can and should be done for stewardship. So I'm going to just list these actions, and then I'll go through each of them in a little bit more detail. So number one is land protection. So preventing land from being converted for agriculture and development, supporting research and monitoring, limiting mowing and brush clearing in areas with native vegetation, restoring areas with native plants, controlling invasive species, maintaining the really specific habitat requirements, so rock piles, woody debris for habitat for sharp-tailed snakes, addressing issues of conifer encroachment that are associated with fire suppression, limiting recreational pressures by decommissioning trails where appropriate, not installing benches and other infrastructure, and sharing data. So I'll go through these one by one in a little bit more detail, and then there'll be lots of time for questions at the end if folks have more specific things that I don't address, or that what they want more information on. Next slide, please. So land protection is probably the number one best thing that we can do for this species. We need to have a top-down approach from having really strong provincial and federal legislation, but we also need bottom-up protection from conservation groups like Islands Trust Conservancy and other NGOs. And this is really critical for addressing this disproportionate number of rare species that are on private land. So outright acquisition is really important, and conservation covenants, which go on the land title, are also really important. According to this paper by Schuster and Arcis that came out in 2015, conservation agreements can be really cost effective and can have savings of 65% compared to land purchase in the Salish Sea. This study really acknowledged that there was a lack of data pertaining to long-term monitoring and legal defense costs and all of those other details that land conservancies need to deal with. But I think that we need to be using pretty much every tool in our toolbox right now to protect whatever we can that's remaining. Next slide, please. So stewardship really begins with knowing which species at risk are present. And that goes back to the point I was making about critical habitat not being able to be designated unless we know where these species are. So a lot of the work that Laura and I have been doing has been focused on doing surveys to try to figure out the distribution of sharp-tailed snakes and have a better understanding of where they occur. So traditional monitoring uses artificial cover objects, which are a really glamorous name for a chunk of square asphalt shingle. And these pieces of shingle are placed in the right kind of habitat for sharp-tailed snakes. So either rocky talus slopes, such as on that bottom left picture, or rotting woody debris are really good habitats for sharp-tailed snakes. So when we're doing the surveys, we can just pick up the artificial cover object, and the snakes have moved up underneath the black asphalt to warm up. And they're more active in the spring and the fall when the asphalt shingle provides just a few more degrees of warmness, and they come up underneath to thermoregulate. And so we can flip over the asphalt shingle and find the snake just curled up on the surface. And that way we don't have to start pulling apart all of the rocks and the woody debris and destroy their home in the process of looking for them. So it's a really great way of finding them, but it can be really labor intensive. There's one site on Salt Spring where the ACOs were in place for 8 years before the first sharp-tailed snake was found. So it can be quite an involved process and very labor intensive. And it's much easier to say that they're there than they're not there. Because if the habitat is there, it may just be that they haven't been able to find these ACOs. There's also been some thinking that in some sites where there's a lot of really good habitat for them to thermoregulate, maybe they just don't use the ACOs, maybe they have better options. So figuring out the distribution of sharp-tailed snakes on a land parcel is really important for knowing where they occur and knowing what kind of management is required on each site. Next slide, please. So what do we know about sharp-tailed snakes? Well, actually, shockingly little. We know that you can recognize each individual snake by their throat pattern. So looking at the pictures on this slide, you can see that there's varying patterns of blotches and dark and white stripes and lines. And each snake has a really distinctive throat pattern. And they also have a really distinctive tail pattern. Some of them are quite pink, some of them are white, some of them have stripes, some of them have little pink blotches on the side, and you can see the white and black bars on the underside. Some of them have branching patterns in those black and white bars. So it makes it really helpful to be able to identify each individual snake, because then we can tell when we have a recapture, which gives us really important information about general sizes of populations and some population dynamic information. You can see how small they are on the picture with Laura taking the photograph. I don't know, Wendy, if you can move your cursor to where the snake is, but they're very camouflaged and lower, a little lower, and then to the left. It's on the wood there. It's on the, there you go. So they're very camouflaged, they're very tiny, and unless you're looking for them, you won't see them. So by doing this capture of them, we can get an idea of how many males and females there are. We can get a sense of how many hatchlings, how many subadults, how many adults. And we have found that they grow incredibly slowly. There was one snake that was recaptured up on Mount Tuam almost 4 years later, and it had only grown by 2 centimeters and increased in weight by half a gram. So they're much slower growing than I think we had realized. It was thought that they had a lifespan maybe of 10 years, but given how slowly this recapture data is showing that they grow, they may be much more long-lived than we think. Next slide, please. There's huge knowledge gaps in what we understand of the biology and ecology of this species. We know that they spend most of their lives underneath the ground, but eggs have only been found in the wild once. In Corvallis, Oregon in the 1960s, there was one hibernaculum found with a bunch of different species, and sharp-tailed snake eggs were found. We think that they lay their eggs on the south or southwest facing exposures so that the eggs can warm up in the sun until they hatch. The eggs are laid in the early spring or summer and hatch in the fall. We think that they eat mostly slugs, but a few years ago, Laura and I found one with a snake in its mouth. So we really don't even know what their diet consists of, although one of the things that Laura and I are working on is we're collecting fecal swabs when we're lucky enough to have snake poop. Then we're sharing it with the province who's doing a prey analysis from the fecal swabs. We really don't understand what the impact of our shifting climate is on this species. In the fall of 2021, despite being out pretty much nonstop doing surveys, we only found one snake. And we think that it may have had something to do with the heat dome in that year, where we had over 40-degree weather for an extended period. But last year in the fall, we also didn't find any snakes, and it could be related to that extended drought that we had during the fall. So we're not really sure if they're moving into more forested habitats because their slug prey is moving into areas where there's more moisture, or whether this is having long-term impacts on the population. And really the only way that we can know is to continue to do this research, because it's just really uncertain what the impacts from a shifting climate is going to do to this species. Next slide, please. So one of the important stewardship things that can be done is to limit mowing and brush clearing. It's really best not to mow unless you're doing it for restoration purposes. This photo on the right is weed whacking of a large exclosure up on Mount Tuam that is on a conservation covenant that's managed by the Islands Trust Conservancy and the Salt Spring Island Conservancy, which was the site of a major restoration project. So mowing in that sense to use as a surrogate for fire is really important, but mowing as a maintenance in areas where it isn't for restoration should be limited, just because snakes can be impacted by the mowing and the weed whacking. If you do have to cut grass, it's really great to just do a walkthrough with really heavy feet through an area to try to get snakes out of the way before you cut, or to keep the grass cut regularly enough that it stays short so you don't have this long grass where garter snakes and other snakes can be hurt by weed whackers and lawnmowers. Leaving leaf piles to decompose and brush piles is always good practices too, just to provide habitat for not just snakes, but also for amphibians, and for brush piles are really great for birds and all kinds of creatures. So messy gardening is a good thing. Next slide, please. Planting native plants is really important for restoration. Most of our Garry Oak meadows have been degraded. Well, all of our Garry Oak meadows have been degraded. There's invasive shrubs that have moved in, and also invasive grasses. So trying to shift that balance back towards more native species is really helpful. Planting native species can help support prey species for sharp-tailed snakes, and also supports native pollinators and aerial insectivores by increasing insect diversity. Next slide, please. Addressing invasive species is a huge concern. It's good job security to be addressing invasive species because they're with us now and here to stay. This is the invasive European wall lizard that has just exploded on southeastern Vancouver Island. It was introduced in the 70s. Well, there were 2 separate introduction events, but there were 12 lizards that were released from a zoo in the Saanich Peninsula, and they've been slowly spreading, and they've since been, in the last few years, have been observed on Salt Spring and Pender, and so they're slowly taking over more and more area. We really don't know the impacts of this species. It's likely that it competes for habitat and also for prey, and it may well eat sharp-tailed snake eggs and juveniles. So the long-term impacts of a quickly spreading voracious lizard like this could be incredibly damaging. Next slide, please. And controlling all other invasive species is also a really great management approach. Shrubs like Scotch broom and gorse create shade, so they limit the light that's getting into these south and west facing slopes, which can limit the sun that's getting on those sharp-tailed snake eggs, and also can limit the sites for thermal regulation. On the left is a crew removing foxglove and mullein from a provincial park because the long flower stems of these can also create some shade. So trying to stay on top of invasive species is a really great management thing to be doing. Next slide, please. Maintaining the open habitat, including these woody debris piles, is really helpful. You can see how the snakes move through this coarse wood, especially that slide or that photo on the upper right. And so they need these open spaces underneath the ground to be able to move underneath. So keeping rock piles, keeping this coarse woody debris is really, really important, and actually maintaining it so that it doesn't get shaded is a really key priority. And we know so little about their movements. At most, they move about 150 meters. So they have a really high site fidelity. They really don't move around a lot. So maintaining the habitat, especially where these site-specific rock piles and wood piles, is really, really important. We think they probably move into the forest or deeper soil in the summer. So protecting those edge habitats is also really important, and not just focusing right on the Garry Oak ecosystems themselves, but also protecting those edge habitats. And there was one snake sighting that was up on Salt Spring that was in it was a small little open pocket, but in a Douglas fir forest. So they may have a much wider range of habitat than our understanding. And we have a really biased survey approach because we use these artificial cover objects that need to get the sun on them to be able to warm up. And they just don't work in forested areas. And so it's hard to know how much is that we're looking in these sites where we've been finding them, but we don't really understand their full range of where they like to be. Next slide, please. Conifer encroachment is another challenging issue at some sites because we've had fire suppression since early settlement that's allowed conifers to infill in some of these open meadows. And because we don't have the fire to get rid of the young seedlings, they're growing up and maturing and really shifting the habitat. There was one site on Mount Tuam that had young conifers move in, where we had sharp-tailed snakes in the site before the conifers were there. And then for years and years of monitoring, there were no sharp-tailed snakes. And we finally were able to get permission to girdle some of the conifers. And then we actually found a sharp-tailed snake in one of the boards again. So it's really important to try to keep this open habitat for the sharp-tailed snakes. Next slide, please. Dealing with some of the recreational pressures is always going to be a challenge. Trying to limit access in these small protected areas that are publicly accessible when people want to get outside and do everything that they can to be engaging with nature in whatever capacity that is, really puts a lot of pressure on things. So limiting trails and benches in areas where you don't have to have them is a really great thing to do. You can see the trail on the bottom there. That was a trail in one of the provincial parks on Salt Spring that's been pretty effectively decommissioned to try to limit traffic in an ecological reserve. Next slide, please. And probably one of the more important things that can be done is sharing data. Sharp-tailed snakes are a really effective umbrella species because they occur in this habitat with this over 100 species at risk in Garryoak ecosystems. They have really high site fidelity. They don't move around very much. And because they also move into these adjacent habitats in the forested areas, if you can effectively protect habitat for sharp-tailed snakes, you're doing probably a pretty good job of protecting habitat for a wide range of other species. And that includes stewardship actions like removing invasive species, addressing things like wall lizards if there is a possible way of doing that. And it's really important for maintaining the habitat that's open and sunny, not just for sharp-tailed snakes, but also for rare plants and keeping throughways for pollinators as well. Knowing where sharp-tailed snakes are found can help us understand how many snakes there are in Canada, where they occur, and how these populations are doing. This is really especially important with climate change issues because of these problems that we're seeing these last couple of falls of not finding any snakes in the fall. And so ongoing monitoring and knowing where snakes are is really important for keeping track of whether these populations are stable or whether they're declining over time. So little is known about these snakes that every little bit of information is important. Even anecdotal stories about having snakes that are appearing that are being moved around by things like robins. There was a landowner on Salt Spring that shared some information about us that they had a little nest, a robin nest on their deck, and the baby robin had fallen out of the nest, and the parents were trying to feed it and brought it a sharp-tailed snake. And the poor little robin just didn't have a clue what was going on. And luckily the landowners knew what a sharp-tailed snake was. They put the robin back in the nest, they put the snake back in some woody debris, and everybody was happy in the end. But because we know so little about these snakes, even knowing that, okay, birds might be a possible vector for moving these around, because it's a real mystery to know how these snakes got to all of these different Gulf Islands, got to these widely remote sites that would have been separated by dark conifer canopies. So having these little snippets of information is really, really important for trying to piece together the biology and ecology of the species. Having information about where the species occurs is also really important for informing critical habitat designation. And once critical habitat is designated, then there's some federal teeth for protection of the species. And because of the way the critical habitat polygons are drawn, if you submit data on one property, that critical habitat can also spill onto adjacent properties that have similar habitat. So by submitting data, you can help protect the habitat, not just on your own land, but also on neighboring properties. So there's a lot of good reasons to share the data and make sure that everyone is aware of where this species occurs. Next slide, please. And I just want to say a big thank you to Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation. Laura and I both have grants from both of these organizations, and we're super grateful to them for supporting this work. And also to a huge range of our partners who we work with quite closely to do surveys on their land, including the Islands Trust Conservancy, CRD Parks, Salt Spring Island Parks and Rec, BC Parks, Nature Trust of BC, Water Preservation Society, and quite a wide range of private landowners who allow us to do surveys on their land. And just another big thank you to Wendy and Gemma for letting us be present today and share our love of sharp-tailed snakes with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's great. Carrina, that was a fantastic presentation. And every time I hear you speak about sharp-tailed snake, I learn more. So I'm really happy about that. So we have plenty of time for questions because we allowed extra on the end of this. So I'm going to ask Laura and Undiné to unmute your mics. And if there are some questions coming in that we're going to start with. So a couple reminders. Put your questions in the chat box, and if you would like to address it to a specific speaker, please let me know in there. Take a moment to stand up and stretch if you need to while we're getting that all ready. And yeah, we'll start with that. So let's see. We have a question from Todd Carnahan. Now that the sharp-tailed snake populations are downlisted to threatened, will the funding for that species disappear?
Hi, Todd. It's been a while since I've seen you. I would guess that it's likely that there will still be funding as long as it stays as threatened. I think if it does ever get downlisted to special concern, then that's sort of appears to be the threshold for where the funding really seems to drop off. We've been really lucky the last few years that the sharp-tailed snake has been a priority species with the habitat stewardship program. So we've been really lucky to be able to take advantage of that to do a lot of sharp-tailed snake surveys. So we're hopeful that the funding will stick around. I don't see the rank changing anytime soon because the status report was just done last year. So I think we have a pretty good window of being able to do snake work for a while, is my sense of it. Unless Undiné has any other thoughts. You're kind of an arm's length from the funding, I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, I work with funding, but I definitely don't make the choices as to what the priorities are for funding.
Yeah.
So,
and
yeah.
I believe it's still in public consultation. So CSIWIC has made the recommendation and it's still in public consultation. So currently it's still listed on Schedule 1 as endangered. There's the populations haven't been separated quite yet.
You're absolutely right, Wendy.
Yeah.
We are in the process of consulting on whether or not the minister should take that, but CSIWIC has already put it forward to us, so that's where we're at.
I just wanted to, I see that Todd was asking about the predated snake being a garter. I'm not sure, Todd, whether you were asking about the snake that was fed to the robin. That was a sharp-tailed snake, but the snake that was in the mouth of the sharp-tailed, or the worm that was in the mouth of the sharp-tailed snake it looked like some sort of a round worm. I'm not quite sure what it was. So just wanted to jump in on that and clarify. Hopefully that answers the question.
It was a very, very, very small snake. Okay, we have Martin Rady. Thanks for the presentation. How important is citizen science, including BioBlitzes and iNaturalist, in helping to gather data on sharp-tailed snakes?
I think it's really, really important. I know that the sharp-tailed snake recovery team is really aware of sightings on iNaturalist and uses them to go through and inform critical habitat. So I think it's really important. I mean, having great photos is key and good coordinates are essential. But if you can have good pictures and you can have good coordinates, then iNaturalist is a really good source for documenting species at risk. It can be a bit challenging when occurrences get masked. That gets a little bit tricky for sort of sifting through them, but It's a really great way of documenting it. I understand one of the challenges with iNaturalist is that if you ever delete your account, then your observation data also disappears with it. So making sure that the data gets shared with the appropriate agencies is really important, and having that sort of backup built into the system is really important.
Great. Does that answer your question? I think so. Okay, we have another question from Karen regarding the disproportionate number of species that are not found on provincial and federal lands. Why is that? Is it just because private lands have more impacts historically?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure why that is. I would think that part of it is because a lot of the private lands are in these ecological hotspots, like in Southeast Vancouver Island, the Gulf Islands, where there's a huge amount of private land compared to federal and provincial land, and also in the Okanagan, where you have a disproportionate amount of private land compared to public lands. Undiné looks like
There's one other piece that we're discussing a lot, actually. I happen to be at the pay workshop in Cowichan Valley, which is all about land use and restoration for cedar. And one of the topics a lot is that the forestry regime is also different on Vancouver Island, and those lands are privately held for a large amount of Vancouver Island. And so I think that those are labeled privately owned lands by forestry companies, but I think that probably plays into it as well, because it's an area with a lot of species at risk and a slightly different understanding of what that private land is.
Okay. And from Luna Bell, do any of the speakers have suggestions for how to approach private landowners about species at risk on their properties to encourage stewardship? Good question. In addition to that, not just private landowners, but industrial business owners as well.
That's a really, really challenging issue, just because there's a perception that if there are species at risk on these private lands, that it can limit what you're doing. So it becomes a really tricky balance with some landowners to try to encourage them to either do surveys or report species at risk on their private lands. Laura, do you have anything you want to add on that one?
Yeah, I think it's always tricky, and every landowner responds differently to being approached. But I think part of what is helpful is building relationships that are long-term. And I've been working with the snake for over 25 years and have known a lot of landowners who, are interested in either looking for them or have found them and call to tell me about their sightings every year. So I know that the snakes are still there. And part of, I think, their comfort is just knowing that they can talk to somebody about it and ask questions and get some feedback about stewardship ideas and things. But just having a relationship, a long-term relationship, is, I think, super important for that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would also add that there's a lot of local conservancies and organizations that are doing some quite good species at risk outreach. And I think, that's a way to increase awareness, and without pinpointing, people with critical habitat on their property specifically. And I think the majority of landowners out there want to ensure they're not doing damage to species at risk. Yeah, but it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah, outreach is a big part of that, and sort of the long game outreach, I think, as well, right? It's something where if some of these organizations or researchers or people who are interacting with landowners, to present information and educate people, and writing articles or having campaigns or putting things on your website so that people can find information about these animals or plants, having webinar series and things like that that's available for people to find the information. I think that helps, because most people are pretty excited when they find something interesting on their, where they live, and they want to know more about it.
Okay, great. I'm going to move on to the next question. Serene has asked, might you have some projects that would benefit from surveys? Okay, she might, NCC, sorry, now I get it. The Nature Conservancy of Canada might have some projects that would benefit from surveys. Is it possible to hire your team for surveys?
Sure, give us a call.
Okay, excellent.
We can send you our email and you can connect with us.
I think Carrina's going to put an email in the chat box at some point here. Okay, Todd has another question. There's critical habitat for Western painted turtle in Cowichan. How can we find out who has collected that data? Maybe a question for Undiné?
It's a good question, and I actually don't know the answer. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. It's been a little while since that document was written. I can look into it, Todd, and get back to you. But yeah, I don't have a good answer right now. I know that, there's a lot of rigor in how they do it, but it's been a little while, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think data points from all different organizations and people who have collected it go into that designation. So it might be hard to find out in particular. Ruby.
If Todd has looked at if it's not listed in the BC CDC, like usually each occurrence there's a record of some, like if you pull up the element occurrence record, but he has probably already done that, but some of them are more cryptic than others.
Yeah, Todd, if you want to unmute and if you have something you want to say about that. I think we're good. Okay. Ruby has a question about plant species at risk and the conflict with deer and otter that are impacting wildflowers on private land. Do you protect the plants with fencing or let nature take its course? Controversial question.
Yeah, my recommendation would be to not let nature take its course and to protect things with fencing if at all possible. I mean, I think that needs to be done in a careful way so that you need to be a little bit careful about the damage caused by fencing when you're putting in fencing posts and limiting potential shade associated with fencing. I know that there's been some sites that have been protected by split rail fencing, and that's actually maybe done more harm than good because the split rails cast so much shade and can kind of change the microhabitats. But I would argue that our current deer populations especially are so altered from historically that letting nature take its course is not really an option for protecting things anymore. So it would have to be done carefully depending on which plant species at risk and with a fence that's big enough to be able to accommodate that, and also just careful watching, because you can have a lot of unintended consequences such as a lot of thatch buildup, and then you can lose sort of open pockets of bare soil that might be needed for germination and that kind of thing. So it needs to be done carefully, but I would argue that our herbivory pressures are so huge that these species need our help.
Okay, I'm going to throw in a question here because you haven't spoken much about the eDNA work that you and Laura are doing. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, no, we didn't go into that at all in this presentation, although it's near and dear to both of our hearts. So we have been using environmental DNA as a complementary survey technique for sharp-tailed snakes. So we have been collecting soil samples from where snakes have been found underneath the ACOs. And we've been also using a cotton finger cut to do a swab of the underside of the ACOs. And so environmental DNA is just bits of DNA that are shed from an organism, either fecal matter or shed scales, or in the case of frogs, mucus. And it's been used quite effectively in aquatic systems to test for frogs and snakes and arthropods and all kinds of things, but it hasn't been used very much in a terrestrial system. So it's been a really novel approach to try to use eDNA for sharp-tailed snakes. And it's kind of miraculous because it's been working. So we've taken a bunch of samples, both where we found snakes and where we haven't found snakes. And just this year, we got our first confirmed positive detection at a site, which is one of the Islands Trust Conservancy covenant properties, where we have detected eDNA, but we've never seen a snake. So it's really exciting to be able to use this as a complementary tool to detect snakes, even when we don't actually have them in hand. So it's really exciting. Happy to answer any more questions on that.
Okay, great. I have a question from Mary Beth or Carrina. I thought much of the loss is in Victorian Saanich, and much of that is due to urbanization. I'm curious how much of Garry Oak habitat loss quoted is in the Islands Trust area of the Gulf Islands. It's a good question.
That is a really good question, and I don't have those numbers at hand, but it would be really interesting to look into.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, there's so much development and urbanization pressure on the Gulf Islands now as well, but it's hard to say. I mean, there's so many other pressures on the Gulf Islands. Salt Spring, for example, where I live, it's just been hammered by overgrazing. So we don't have the same kind of floral displays that there is in the Saanich Peninsula or those other Garry Oak ecosystems, just because the early sheep grazing and the deer pressure has been so heavy. So, but in terms of just area, I don't know. That would be a really interesting thing to look into.
Yeah, I would say that it's something I've been thinking about lately too, and that it would be a great project for someone to look at that and remap it, because so much has happened since that, 5% number was come up with quite a long time ago, quite a handful of years ago. And so, we continue to lose Garry Oak ecosystems, and I would think that it's even a smaller number today.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's based on Ted Lee's mapping, that's going back a ways now. It's got to be at least 20 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So I would not be surprised if it's a smaller number, but I haven't seen anything else published. So it would be good to revisit that.
Agreed. I'm thinking, and I wish I knew this off the top of my head, but the Islands Trust Conservancy has a conservation plan which has looked in quite detail into habitat loss for each island. I don't know we have specifics for Garry Oak ecosystems, but I know there's a lot of information and statistics in the plan that might answer some of those questions, which you can find on our website. Another question from Richard. Have you been able to estimate population densities at any of the surveyed sites?
The short answer to that is no. We put some time into really thinking about occupancy modeling earlier this year, and talked to a lot of folks who have a lot more experience with it than we do. And the short of it is that we just don't have enough information yet. It would be kind of a garbage in, garbage out to do any kind of occupancy modeling to come up with a number. There's just too many unknowns with it. Yeah, so no, we don't have any numbers yet. It's sort of a more of a general sense of kind of how the population is structured at this point. It's interesting though, because last year we had more recaptures than in any other year that we've been doing this work. So I'm not sure what that means, but yeah. Do you have anything you want to chime in on that, Laura?
No, we've been talking about occupancy modeling potential, and it's very challenging with a cryptic species where there's a lot of data gaps to do it effectively, like Carrina was saying. So we are looking into that and talking with the recovery team and other researchers about that, but that it hasn't really practically been done yet.
Okay. And kind of to add to that, in what we were talking about with the designation downlisting, separating the two populations and downlisting from endangered to threatened, the population that we have here. And yet I hear from all biologists working with sharp-tailed snake that we don't know, still don't know much about them, where they are, how they disperse. So I'm curious if you feel comfortable speaking to that downlisting potential, since we are in public comment right now.
You're asking Laura and I how we feel about the downlisting?
And yeah, just, or do you feel like we have enough information about sharp-tailed snake in our area? Family, the dynamics, dispersal, the threats, and how much of a threat is the European wall lizard, and how is it impacting the populations? And with climate change, it just seems an odd time to be making a decision to downlist when we still have so much information.
Yeah, I wasn't involved in any of the threat calculation calls. I have a lot of respect and trust the folks that were. The COSEWIC has a pretty stringent set of numbers of populations, population sizes, all of those kinds of things that feed into those calculations, but I can't really speak to what went on with how those threats were ranked or any of those details.
Yeah, I don't have specific details to add about that either, but as Carrina said, when the numbers change and when we find new populations, so we know they're in more places because more people are looking, that helps to provide the data. And so, when we first were doing research, there was 8 sites and at all known in Canada because there was so little done with these snakes. And then when you go back years later and update and you look at, we have all this other information now, they make decisions to adjust it based on that type of thing, also knowing that there are other locations and it's not just limited to these handful of sites. So that has something to do with it. Undiné, you might have a lot more information.
I also was not involved in the threats calls or anything, but the one thing that's worth keeping in mind is that the proposed change in listing from endangered to threatened doesn't change the protections at all under the Species at Risk Act. So they both will still have critical habitat identified and all of the protections for those species stand. So there isn't a change in regulations or anything around that shift. If things go down to, if there's a change from like a higher level of threat to the species down to a special concern, that's where you will see that shift away. Can't say I've seen it a lot of times, but it is a scenario that can come up, and it often is because a lot more data has come forward, right? So
it is a great question though, Wendy. Like we do know so little, and it's something to keep in mind and think about. We do, there are so many species that we know so little about, and particularly in these ecosystems that are facing a lot of threats as well. So
it's true about many of our species at risk here, right? Okay, just to mention that in the chat room, there is some interesting conversations going on. This chat will be saved and we'll record this conversation and send that out as well about fencing. So I think there is a lot of questions about fencing and long-term results. So I think these conversations are really good to have. Let's see. More questions from Dana. I'm curious if water could be used as an attractant during the drought years to improve capture rates. In the Okanagan, we have detected snakes at creeks and in dried up ephemeral ponds where their soil is still wet and cool.
I'm not sure about that. You know, the places where these snakes are, where we're doing our surveys, there's no water anywhere around in many of those sites. So my sense is, like Carrina was suggesting, that, you know, they may be moving around more in the evenings when there's some condensation and slugs are out more. They may be moving into shadier habitats for prey. They may not be feeding anywhere near as much as we think they might need to eat, you know, so they may be able to be fine for long periods of time, not getting food sources. So, I mean, I'm not sure. My sense is for sharp-tailed snakes, the water features may not have the same effect as some other snakes that might be more attracted to that.
Thanks, Laura. We have a question from Jennifer regarding land trust use decisions being made by the Islands Trust. What would the panelists say about an environmental assessment that is requested from an applicant applying for rezoning in order to develop land where a species at risk assessment is not included?
I think in many development applications, a species at risk assessment is not included. Isn't that the case? Like, I think that's kind of more the standard than the rule to have no species at risk assessment done. I mean, I think that we definitely need to shift that and be able to have a lot more just checks and balances to be able to protect some of these natural spaces, but that becomes incredibly challenging with private lands and ownership and all of those murky kinds of questions. So, but my sense is that's the status quo right now.
On a good note, I think it just recently I've had 2 inquiries from realtors actually and new landowners on a couple of the islands who the planners have tagged that their property overlaps with critical habitat. So I've had some really good conversations with landowners and realtors around what that means. It's a slow start, but part of the work that I'm doing is internal outreach and education with planners and bylaw. And our staff at Islands Trust Conservancy works closely with Islands Trust when we can on those properties where there is flags, and the planners are aware of all the known species at risk occurrences. And so they have those red flags in front of them, which can go in, usually goes into the report that goes back to the applicant. Okay. I hope that helps anyways. We have a question from Alyssa. Let's see, invasive species such as flowering plants, for example, can sometimes provide habitat requirements for certain native species. When having one species mined for recovery, it's easy to determine that the invasive species is negatively impacting the specific native species. How do we integrate benefits that the invasive species could potentially have with other species within the ecosystem, which we know some host plants, pollinator plants, do that. So would anybody, Carrina or Laura, like to talk on that?
Sure, I can chime in on that one. And I mean, it's certainly a challenging one. It's something that we've dealt with up on Mount Tuam, where we've been trying to control some of the foxglove and the thistles in quite a limited area, but also with being mindful that there are a lot of rare butterflies up there that use these thistles for a nectar source. So it's it's tricky to try to navigate all that, especially with our limited understanding of exactly all of the interactions between these different species. I mean, I think one of the best things that we can do is just try to maintain as much diversity as possible, and our chances of actually fully eradicating some of these invasive species is almost nil. So likely they'll be present in the landscape. But I think trying to understand as much of those interactions as possible before doing anything too drastic is always a good approach. So to try to do as little harm as possible and try and gain as much information as possible before having really big landscape changes is really important. So I think, I mean, especially with invasive plants, you know, depending on what kind of habitat they're replacing, of trying to replace those invasives with a similar functional group. So something that blooms at the same time or has the same structure as the species that you're removing is also a pretty good sort of overarching thing, if possible. That's my 2 cents.
Laura, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say some of what the last bit that Carrina said, that, you know, adding a diversity of other things before you remove something else, maybe, or like a cookie cutter approach where you start to replant some native plants and have, like Carrina said, a variety of things that bloom at different times for different species over the whole, you know, summer, spring, and fall blooming periods. And then chip away at your invasive species as you replace it with other things, so that there's never a totally depauperate landscape with nothing for them. So
it's always a good idea to spread out that pollinator season as long as you can. I know I was working on a site where we were removing orchard grass in late fall, and I found, you know, eggs on the stem, the dead stem of a standing stem of orchard grass, which I hadn't heard about, you know, a species that was preferring that invasive species. So we're always learning something new.
Wendy, do you know?
Hmm?
What were the eggs from?
I don't know. I never did get an ID. I still have the picture though. I can send it out. Okay. I think that's all of the questions that we have. I have one last question because, you know, I've had the pleasure of working with both of you with these amazing snakes, and I have a question. Do you have hope? You know, are you seeing evidence that these snakes are more common than we thought? And I don't want to say climate change aside, because we can't put it aside, but yeah, like how are you feeling?
I think it's pretty mixed. I mean, I feel like it's encouraging to be able to keep finding them in new locations where we both suspected that they would be, and to actually find them. I mean, I feel hopeful in the incredible conservation community that we have in this area that is doing such good work and making a positive difference in so many different avenues, including public outreach and the research. But it's definitely a case of a death by 1,000 cuts, you know, and that's one of the things about being a field biologist and actually seeing these changes on the ground, that every little bit of habitat that gets destroyed is, it just hurts, you know, it's painful. So yeah, I feel kind of mixed. So, depends which day you catch me on. How hopeful I am.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, I think that wraps us up for the presentation here. Before we have anybody else head off the session here, I want to remind everyone that we have 4 more webinars in our speaker series, so don't forget to register. And you'll discover when you end the meeting, you'll be directed to a Zoom generated survey. So if you have a moment, please take the time to help complete this by helping us improve future sessions. And I'd like you to feel free to unmute yourself and join me in a round of applause. Thank you, Carrina, Laura, and Undiné, for all of your work that you're doing, for this great presentation. And yeah, and also thanks to Gemma for her support. All right. Thanks, everybody. Zoom applauses, they're tough. All right.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you so much. All
Thank
right.
you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.